Hello, folks. Welcome to Inside the Marble Palace, Postmedia's hopefully weekly broadcast on the goings-on of the Saskatchewan Legislature. I'm Murray Mandrick, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post. With me this week is, per usual, Arthur White-Crummey, our legislative reporter for the Leader Post, Star Phoenix, and joining us again this week, Zak Vescera from the Star Phoenix, a smart young man who knows all about COVID and has done some great work. Great story today, by the way, related to the COVID-19 contact tracer. We'll get into that in a moment, Zach, but I think this is such an important story to talk about. But Arthur, let's begin with the week's big events, which are canceling Christmas. Sadly, it was inevitable. But it took on a whole different tone and meaning, I thought, and maybe describe the feeling in the room at the time, because I wasn't there. I was just on the phone, and sometimes people don't get a real good sense of how tough these decisions are, what it's like, unless they're in the room, and you were in the room. So tell us about what happened and kind of how it felt in there.
Yeah, well, so they were clearly the strongest measures that we've seen of this second wave of the pandemic so far. And Scott Moe never wanted to get here. He continued to hold out hope for weeks that there would be some way of saving Christmas. That was unfortunately not to be. No inter-household private gatherings except for single people in certain very isolated cases. It was sobering. Scott Moe tried to stay as staid as he possibly could. But what really stuck out to me was that it didn't have the same sense of desperation that we saw from, say, Brian Pallister when he made a similar announcement in the province of Manitoba. So I asked Scott Moe why he wasn't giving that same sort of desperate warning to people, and we didn't really get the same sense of emotion. I think he was just trying to stay very factual, very pragmatic. It's clear that he had been sort of backed into this corner by the case numbers that are remaining stubbornly high.
Yeah. And that's true. That's true. And I think it's part of his nature. He's not an overly emotional guy. He's pretty straightforward in terms of the news he delivers you. He made one joke, and he's getting the crap beat of him on Twitter for basically saying he was out with a walk with his dad, and it was so cold the COVID virus wouldn't have survived even if he had it. Well, of course that's not true. And whether he kind of was making a joke at the time or just trying to ease the tension of the situation, who knows? But it was one. I guess it speaks to how absolutely triggered people are on this. Have you guys noticed that? I can't put out the daily stats, just the very basic daily stats on my Twitter feed of how many deaths there are, how many new cases there are, how many recoveries there are, without getting someone really mad at just the straight numbers and how the numbers are presented. And I find that to be fascinating. What's your sense, Zach, in terms of how absolutely frustrated people are with this week's announcement, I guess, and certainly just having to deal with this over and over again?
Well, I think I appreciate you, Murray, reaching out to the Gen Z kid. I am extremely online, as people know. I think you have
Me too, buddy. Well, we're about the same age, aren't we?
Yeah. Right. I think
if you guys had your age together, you almost equal me. But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. Well, math was never my strong suit. That's why I'm in journalism. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that social media is always a hall of mirrors, and it really gives two very distorted realities. It brings out the partisan in us. I think on the ground, it's a little more measured out. But I do think that from talking to people, from doing interviews with experts who are also people and also thinking about what their Christmases look like this year, people are definitely not happy with it. I think for whatever reason, more so than Halloween, which is a big party holiday, and more so than Thanksgiving, which is also about family, I think Christmas really strikes a nerve with a lot of people. I think that's part of the reason why leaders in this country have been really hesitant about canceling Christmas, as it were, or have even gone so far as to propose various compromises and ways that people can still get together. What remains to be seen, basically, is how many people are going to follow the rules, how many people are going to keep it tight this Christmas, and how much high-risk activity are we going to avoid. I think one thing that we should address if we're talking about Christmas is that This private gathering change was actually, on the surface to me, almost one of the smaller things that came out of this batch of announcements. We saw some bigger moves in terms of limiting retail space starting after Christmas Eve. We saw the shutdown of bingo halls and casinos. But I think that the reason this got so much response is that people were still holding out that little bit of hope that they could maybe gather for this holiday season, right? And yeah, the question that kind of remains to be seen is that going to happen? Are people going to be able to tough it out?
What do you think, Arthur? Do you think that there's still significant blowback on Mo for the incremental moves that he's made over the last month and a half? And it started obviously with masks in Regina and Saskatoon and Prince Albert, I believe, on November 9th, and then moving to the whole province, at least provinces, communities above 5,000, then the whole province. And then making these smaller incremental moves, finally getting around, I guess, to closing bingo halls and casinos, and that seemed just to trigger people. Is there a sense that it might have been a bit of a mistake now to not pull off the Band-Aid all at once and have some kind of circuit breaker? Certainly that was the position put forward by Ryan Miley and the NDP. And I do sense a certain level of stubbornness on Mo and the Sask Party government basically saying, well, we just can't do that because it would be inappropriate. He actually raised out the possibility this week, Arthur, that might happen. Why the change of heart is explained by Scott Moe, or did he really get into that as much as you thought he would?
I don't think we saw a change of heart so much as we saw him continue to follow the trajectory of the numbers in a fairly reactive way. And that's, of course, what Ryan Miley and a lot of public health doctors have been criticizing since the beginning of this second wave, that if you do this early, the kinds of restrictions you have to put in place are not as painless as they ultimately become the longer you wait. And I think we're going to continue to see that criticism. We continue to see that criticism from the NDP directly after this announcement was made. It was actually some of the harshest criticism that I heard from Ryan Miley, saying that this is chaotic, saying that it's rife with contradictions. We're seeing families still able to theoretically meet at restaurants. They can rent out a hall if they want to have a gathering with up to 30 people under certain very, restrictive public health measures, but the contradictions remain. And I thought the NDP was fairly effective at pointing that out. I don't think that this approach is going to be winning Scott Moe any fans among some of the most outspoken voices within the public health community. Despite the fact that they are the strongest measures so far, they're coming later than they could have.
I think you're right, but I get as frustrated with all the niggling criticisms related to where we are now, because I think where we are now is where we're inevitably going to be at Christmas time in 2020. It seemed inevitable with this second wave, and regardless of who was in government and what policies were being put in place, that we'd face this ugly reality that cases would go up at this time of year, deaths would go up at this time of year because they're now in the personal care homes, and this is just a sad reality of the second wave. Is there not some recognition, I guess, I'll start with you, Arthur, on the part that this was kind of a likelihood, and is Mo not getting at least some credit for moving forward on that, or is it just too raw right now because, as Zach said, it's Christmas time and everybody is kind of triggered about the whole notion of not seeing their families and not being able to do these things?
Well, even Scott Moe told me in our year-end interview that he's continuing to receive a lot of messages, even from people within his social circle who are frustrated about having lost Christmas. He told me that he's getting more of those messages.
Oh, is that right?
People criticizing him for moving too slowly. Make of that what you will, but that's at least what he says in terms of his own personal feedback. So that is I think there may be more emotion in the general population about the impact of these measures on people's personal and family lives than about the risk of the disease. But quite honestly, as I said earlier, Mo has been forced into this corner by the circumstances and by the continued stubbornly high rate of cases.
You know what I thought was real, and I'm just going to carry this on for you for a second, Arthur. What I thought was a real turning point was the reaction to the goof on the steps of the legislature talking about Shahab and offering his usual media hate, which we're kind of used to, we get. But the real turning point, I think, was basically going after Shahab in the way he did, because that became a real unifying factor, I think, for people all across the province from all kinds of political persuasions, basically saying, no, this doesn't help. This isn't good. This signifies more about what you and your movement is about than any good you might be offering or any legitimate criticism that might be offered by the so-called freedom rallies. You've talked very extensively, not to the man in question, but certainly to the leader of these freedom rallies, Mark Friesen. Do you get a sense, Arthur, that the movement in this regard is starting to wane, and people are kind of sort of seeing that maybe some of the things being offered, in my mind, the petulance that we see from Mr. Friesen about just simply not accepting, even when the arguments are presented to him in a very real scientific way on social media, that no, you're wrong about the testing results, or no, you're wrong about the comorbidities and all the other things that we talk about on a daily basis. He just seems unwilling to accept that. Do you think that there's been a bit of a turning point in terms of the public interest, notwithstanding how frustrated people are about not having Christmas?
Yeah, well, I think that with the comments that we heard about Dr. Shahab, really that particular movement has discredited themselves in a much wider circle of the population. There may have been people that were sympathetic to the outrage about the lockdown measures. Certainly, it's not popular in every segment of the community, but I saw people who are certainly on the right of the political spectrum who were condemning those comments, calling them racist, calling them xenophobic, very quickly. I'm thinking of people from down in Estevan that were involved even with some of the United We Roll rallies, who were finding that to be unacceptable. So that's interesting. And you're right that Friesen is certainly going to continue to express beliefs about the validity of testing, about the effectiveness of masking, regardless of the evidence that seems to be presented to him on social media. I think that this rally lives in a very different information ecosystem than the rest of us. They're getting their information from totally different sources, and they're not really accessible to evidence and rational argument from the other side, because they view it as fundamentally biased and tainted and in league with some sort of conspiracy to suppress their freedoms. So
damn those people and their book learning, huh? Yeah.
It
is. But there are problems. And Zach, I want to bring you in here because you did a great story today on the problems with contact tracing. And one statistic that came out of the presentation that Arthur was at and we were watching over TV and phone the other day was the source of the spread. And from what I could see on the charts that were presented, 56% of the active cases are still described as cases where we don't know the origin or we aren't able at this point to trace the origin. And they have a whole list of other smaller cases, and I think it creates about 25% of the total, where they talk about maybe it's in restaurants, maybe it's in casinos, maybe it's in other activities that are going on. But it's actually a fraction compared with just not knowing where the spread is. How is that playing out, and how is that playing out for the contact tracers that you talk to and their relative frustration with this, Zach?
Well, there's one distinction I want to draw there, Murray, which is that not knowing the setting of transmission is not the same thing necessarily as not knowing the source.
That's true. Yeah.
You might know, for example, for sure that you got COVID-19 from, say, your daughter or your buddy, but you might not know exactly where you got it because you've been hanging out in multiple settings. So there's a lot of stuff that,
Or
a
you
lot
might
of
not know where they got it. It's complicated, right?
it's a complicated chain, but I think the really important thing to remember here is that, and this has been known from the beginning, contact tracing and testing are very important public health tools that tell us a lot about the transmission of COVID-19 in Saskatchewan, but they only tell us about the cases that we are able to identify. They're not telling us about people who are necessarily like asymptomatic, for example, or people who are pre-symptomatic. They're sick with COVID-19, they don't know it yet. One thing my colleague Alex McPherson reported here out of Saskatoon City Hall was that a local MHO, Dr. Jasmine Hasselback, spoke to City Council and said that, yeah, there might be somewhere in the realm of, let's say, 1,500, 1,400, 1,300 active cases that we know about in Saskatoon. But based on Dr. Hasselback's sort of projections and her estimations, she said that it's very likely there's 4,000 to 5,000 people in Saskatoon who have COVID-19 who did not know it at that time for whatever reason. So we really do have a situation, according to most MHOs in this province, where the spread is uncontrolled, which is why we have the strictest public health measures that we've had in this second wave of the pandemic. What that means for contact tracers is, frankly, just a lot of work. One of the things that came out of that story was that
talk about that, because your story was very much on a human level, how tough it is for those particular people to be able to simply do their jobs. And tell us.
And this isn't one group of people, right? Like the thing that we call contact tracing, which was definitely not a household term, I think, for most people before March, is actually a whole bunch of different processes, right? You get a result from the lab, you inform that person of their results, then you have to start the process of jogging that person's memory, going through where they've been. Then you reach out to anyone else who might be at risk if that person is positive. Then over the course of that person's recovery, you're checking in with them, making sure they're okay, keeping track of their symptoms, and eventually, hopefully, marking when they've recovered from COVID-19.
Have they ever thought of using my teenage daughter for this, by the way? Because she can seem to trace everybody on social media and know exactly where they are. I have no idea why they're. It's an underused resource. That's
what we call stalking in the biz. I was thinking this is actually a lot like what journalists do, right?
It is.
But that ends up being a whole ton of work. One of the examples that was given to me is that if a child in a classroom in Saskatchewan tests positive for COVID-19, and that does happen, then right now policy for many school divisions is that everyone in that classroom has to go home and self-isolate now, remote learning for that class, which means that a contact tracer has to phone every single person in that class, let them know how to self-isolate, fill them in on the details, and check to see if they have any symptoms. That can take a full day for one person to do. I think one of the stats that we had from early December were that as of December 3rd, there were more than 12,000 close contacts in Saskatchewan. So in other words, more than 1% of the province's population was at that point identified as being a close contact. And by the way, I think more than 1 in 100 residents of this province have tested positive for COVID-19 since this pandemic began. Many of those cases are still active. That's the sheer volume that we're talking about in terms of how many people contact tracers have had to phone.
Arthur, what's this going to look like going forward from Christmas and on? Because we're going to see a very different Saskatchewan. Retail sales are going to be very different. I assume we're unfortunately going to see the ugly reality of COVID in nursing homes and a higher death toll that'll just sort of follow these numbers, even if there is a continuation of this leveling off. And let's understand that the weekly averages are sort of leveling off to sort of around 260 a week level. The reason that I think the chief medical health officer and the premier described this is their restrictions as necessary is that level is still high and they want it lower. But what's it going to look like? Is it realistic that we can get a lower number? And what is it they are asking us to do to achieve that lower number?
Well, so this current round of restrictions expires on January the 15th. So we have until then to try to to try to get as much good out of them as we possibly can. And again, as Dr. Shahab and Scott Moe emphasized, that really relies on all of us following them to the greatest extent possible. What I found interesting is that we didn't see any new enforcement measures to ensure that people do point. So. That was not addressed at the press conference. And what was interesting was just the week before, a government brought out a new piece of legislation that was framed as a way of increasing the fines and increasing the penalties to respond to the COVID-19 situation, but it's not even going to be passed until the spring, and it doesn't even raise fines to the same level that's already available in a different piece of legislation. So really, we haven't seen anything to get a handle on people that may continue to break the restrictions. And it's an open question whether, given how significant Christmas is for the population, whether that's going to become even more problematic through this season. So really, what we see in the future, what we see from now until January the 15th, is going to depend on how tightly people follow this new round of measures. At that point, again, Dr. Shahab is going to be responsible for assessing whether the case numbers remain unsustainable or not. And he's given, I believe, Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, 10 cases per 100,000 population as sort of the metric for whether we can sort of loosen some of these public health measures.
What's your sense? Is that achievable, Zach? Do you think we can get there?
I think it's certainly possible to get there. Obviously, one you have to kind of hope, but I definitely don't have a background in epidemiology that would tell you how to get there exactly. Arthur is right. What Dr. Shahab has said is kind of within the feasible range is 120 new cases a day. What is preferable is that we are at fewer than 60. Right now, we're averaging somewhere in the 260 range. What's kind of interesting about Saskatchewan, I don't really know of another province that's in our exact pickle right now. The case numbers aren't really going down that fast. We've kind of just like plateaued at a really unfortunate altitude. So as to what gets us down, I don't really see a perfect solution in sight. If I think I knew the answer, I'd be making a lot more money at a different job.
Yeah, and that is the unfortunate reality. So I guess the only option is to do what we're doing, which is hold tight for Christmas, hope that the new measures after Christmas largely and leading up to Christmas actually work, kind of hope that people play ball and follow the restrictions in a way, and certainly hope that something happens where the spread isn't so bad in the critical places like nursing homes. It doesn't make for a very Merry Christmas for many of us, but hey, if I don't see you guys again, let's have a Merry Christmas. I think we'll try to do one more of these before Christmas and such to wrap up the year. But I guess we all sit tight.
Can I throw one more?
Make the most of it.
Can I throw one more thing on the record if we have time? I think maybe just to wrap up a thought that Arthur brought in there with some of the perceived contradictions in the new restrictions. The fact that you can go to a restaurant with a table of 4 people, but you can't have another household necessarily visiting you. You can go and rent a banquet hall, but you can't have that, like private gathering at home. And I think, as Arthur pointed out, one of the justifications that government has given for this is that those settings have ideally more kind of safety restrictions and precautions than you would at home when you're relaxed and you're kind of just doing whatever. But I think the real challenge is, does that message get across to the general public? And if people start to identify...
I don't think it works. And my problem with it is why I don't think it does work is because people aren't accepting it. They see their home as a bit of a sanctuary, and they don't see restaurants and or bars as a bit of a sanctuary in the same way. And thus the frustration. And it kind of goes back to the Christmas thing, because once again, we're in a situation where people really want that peaceful time of year where they gather with their families, whom they assume are safe. And I don't know if they're going to get that this year. It's a good point, but I don't know if and I hear what you're saying about the public frustration on this particular part, because it truly is that. Unfortunately, we're kind of wrapped up for time here this week. So I thank you both. Merry Christmas if I don't see you again, and we'll look forward to more of these chats just down the road at some point, hopefully when there's less cases. Take care, guys.
Merry Christmas.
Thanks so much, Merry Christmas.